right, welcome everyone. We are getting close to the end of our digital humanities series on digital humanities on US LDH, US Latino Digital Humanities, our center here at the University of Houston. My name's Gabriela Baez-Aventura, and I'm Associate Professor of Spanish in our department, in the Department of Hispanic Studies. I'm also the Executive Editor of Arte Público Press, and the co-founder of the first Digital Humanities Center on U.S. Latino Studies at Arte Público Press and Recovery. It is an honor for us today to welcome Jennifer Giuliano to the University of Houston. We have had very wonderful and very productive meetings over the past few days with her, and we are delighted that she agreed to do this talk and this conversation that we're sharing with the world. But before I introduce her and let her do her talk, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Mellon Foundation, specifically Don Waters and of course Patricia Choi, for their leadership and the guidance and the support in giving us a planning grant that allowed us to travel throughout the U.S., visit digital humanities centers, and bring in incredible scholars to talk to our constituents here at the University of Houston. I should also like to address it, say that we stand, of course, on the shoulders of Dr. Nicolás Canelos, who is the founder and director of Arte Público Press and Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage, on the support of my colleague and co-founder of the Digital Humanities Center, Dr. Carolina Villarroel. She's the director of research here at our center. Our CLEAR postdoc fellow, Lorena Gothero, who you see in social media very actively, giving us a name out there. So please follow us and tag your work. If you're doing U.S. Latino digital humanities work, please tag your work with hashtag USLDH so that we can include you in as part of our community. And lastly, but firstly, I should say, we also work very closely with our graduate students, Isis Campos, Silvia Fernandez Quintanilla, Annette Zapata. Who else am I missing? Research students who have collaborated with us over the past few years on the Digital Humanities series, and so it's through their work in the community that supports us here at the University of Houston that this is made available. I'd like to make two very brief announcements. Our next talk is going to be the last talk of the series is by Julia Flanders, and she'll be here on November 29, and that'll be an evening talk. She'll be here. She'll be presenting at 2 on a Thursday and not on a Friday. And then one thing that we are very proud of and very honored to announce is that Carolina Villarroel and myself have been invited to teach a class for the prestigious HILT program led by Jen Giuliano and Trevor Munoz. So we will be offering a class. It's already announced. There are scholarships available. So please attend. This is going to be, I mean, if you don't want to attend our class, it's fine, but definitely attend HILT. It is a wonderful experience. You get to network and meet people that are truly committed to the work that we're doing in digital humanities. And we've participated in it. Our students have participated in it for the past 2 years, and it's been a wonderful experience. So our class is titled Digital Humanities and Latino Studies, Doing Work That Matters. So you'll learn a lot about the work that we do, and we hope that you learn something, fabulous to it. So I'll now proceed to introduce Dr. Jennifer Giuliano, who is she currently holds a position as Associate Professor in the Department of History and affiliated faculty in both Native American Studies and American Studies at the Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. She is co-director of the Humanities Intensive Teaching and Learning Initiative, also known as HILT, and co-author with Simon Appleford of devdh.org, a resource for digital humanities project development. Her talk today is titled Indigeneity, Open Access in the Digital Humanities. and she really will kick ass.
So much pressure.
Yes.
Thanks for having me. Good morning. I appreciate you guys sort of giving me the space to talk a little bit about this. I'm delighted to sort of wrap up my time here at Arte Público and the Recovery Project talking about something that is near and dear to my heart, which is where Indigenous studies and digital humanities can and should meet. And I should mention that this talk is a very, very, very small portion of an actually much, much longer article that's going to be forthcoming. I've been working on an article for almost a year and a half now with Carrie Heitman, who's a cultural anthropologist at the University of Nebraska, who works with the Chaco Canyon and Hopi recovery projects. And so we've been working together to sort of develop a framework of thinking about Indigenous data studies and Indigenous data and digital humanities and sort of how it works. So much of what you're going to hear today is either co-written together or is completely informed by our conversations about doing Indigenous work, particularly as white women, and what does it mean to sort of take these things on. So what I'm going to be talking about at the beginning of this talk is to give you a little bit of an introduction to the Digital Native American and Indigenous Studies project. DNAS, which is the acronym that we love and use because it's too long of a title otherwise, was an NEH-funded Institute for Advanced Topics grant that ran from 2016 to 2019 around the US. So we ran one workshop at the University of Northern Arizona, we ran a workshop at the Yale Indian Papers Project, and we ran a workshop at IUPUI in Indianapolis, with each workshop sort of focusing on Indigenous peoples of that sort of geographical region. So each one sort of had a slight emphasis into the communities around those institutions and sort of what was going on. And the goal of this workshop was to have a conversation and to increase participation by humanists, librarians, cultural heritage workers, information scientists, and actual members of tribes and their organizations to discuss how we deal with research and teaching about Native peoples through issues of access, preservation, design, and pedagogy, specifically around digitized and born digital cultural heritage materials. So really what this workshop was an attempt to sort of understand or to do a sort of live survey in the room of what are the things that sort of everyone is encountering in their teaching and research about Indigenous peoples that the digital humanities either knows about or doesn't know about, which is much of what we discovered, is that the digital humanities and Indigenous studies are basically operating on completely separate and parallel spheres of conversation. To give you a sense of sort of what that looked like, we had a pretty broad spectrum of sort of authority levels, academic and non-academic in the room. 21 assistant professors, 8 librarians, 19 graduate students, fellows, postdocs, 1 director of a Smithsonian like entire group, right? Like that's pretty incredible. Directors of programs, directors of DH programs, museum members, people who ran digital editions and papers that are sort of separate from their institutions, and all kinds of sort of random professional staff members, whether it's people that were working with Native education or people who were sort of engaged with trying to understand what digital humanities could bring to their sort of community of practice. And for us, our goal with pulling these attendees was to try and represent all the different people who had stakes in the conversation about what digital work is and how it's sort of crafted and constructed and rewarded. And in particular, we were pretty proud of our Native representation in the workshop. We're pretty sure it was the largest group of Native people working on a workshop in the digital humanities ever. And we're also pretty sure that other than like ATOM, the Association of Tribal Cultural Heritage and Museums, it was the first time the words Indigenous and digital humanities had happened together in concert by an actual federal funder. The NEH has a history of funding, small projects for linguistic, development or, some small digitization. They funded at the time a game called Mound Builders, where they developed like a little K-6 game to teach kids about mound culture from the Ohio Hopewell. But this was the first time they'd really sort of wholesale an Office of Digital Humanities or an office in NEH had really backed the notion that talking about the digital world required tribal participation and not just sort of one tribal member per group, but actually recognizing that there's a lot of sort of discussion and dissension within tribal communities themselves. And so part of what DNAS did was to try and bring together people who could offer different vantage points and subdisciplines and different tribal vantage points on the issues that they confronted. And I should note that I was part of a very large team for this, including a social justice and education scholar, Charlie Champion Shaw, who herself is Northern Cheyenne, anthropologist and museum studies scholar, Holly Cusack McVeigh, who works with tribal communities in Alaska, Larry Zimmerman, who's one of the sort of founding people of Indigenous cultural anthropology, information scientist Josh Wells, anthropologist Carrie Heitman, and one of my favorite people in the digital humanities, if you get the chance to meet her, you should, Siobhan Zinier, who's a literary studies scholar who works on Dawnland Voices in New England. And the six of us sort of came together explicitly to try to surface the issues that researchers, teachers, and community members were confronting when thinking about digital technologies and digital techniques. The success of the series, to be super blunt, didn't lay with us. It wasn't what we'd crafted as a curriculum. It was actually in the contributions of the participants. It was incredibly rewarding to have participants who were so forthcoming about what they understood, what they struggled with, and what they wanted to know more about. Today, I want to highlight a little bit of that journey to explore how the digital humanities has to confront what Indigenous studies brings to it. And I'm going to specifically talk about three concepts: the issue of the colonial archive, the preference for open access in the digital humanities, and what computational access means. And I'm going to riff on some things if you attended the last two talks that you heard, one from Trevor about, why is the digital humanities so white and what does Black digital humanities look like, and Thomas Padilla's work on computational access and collections of data. So we're going to try, the three of us talked. I'm going to try and tie some things together across the week. So this could be really successful or it could fall flat on its face. So I should take the blame if it doesn't work. So what I'm actually going to start with is actually a traditional analog book. How many of you guys are familiar with Jody Bird? Jody Bird is a Chickasaw cultural anthropologist and theorist who has written this really fabulously dense theoretical book all about the ways in which the cultural and political trajectories of Indianness, how it has functioned as a central tenet of the physical expansion of U.S. empire, but also how the success of the settler colonial state has really been something that has sort of wiped away and erased what it means to be Indigenous and how indigeneity functions, right? We've naturalized indigeneity into our systems to the point that we no longer recognize that those systems themselves started with Indigenous peoples. And the gesture here, of course, is to things like not just the Constitution, but also to literary tropes and cultural heritage apparel and all of those things, right? We've taken the indigeneity out of them to the point that we now just consider them simply American. Bird's book, The Transit of Empire, is a call for scholars to reckon with the existence of Native peoples and their continued erasure through supposedly progressive, post-racial, liberal multiculturalism. For Bird, the transit of indigeneity is both a global colonial empire and its associated indignities, but also a parallel adoption of Indigenous peoples to what constitutes Indianness within the political and social worlds colonialism enacted. In other words, very simply, like you, Bird's work is about recovery, to identify a platform for contemporary Native theoretical, political, and cultural thought, and it's also a metacognition. She argues that the liberal multicultural project, which is basically, education and all of American life right now, nullifies some of the most important things that Indigenous people have to say and what they can claim. Land and its dispossession, political sovereignty, and the notion that Indians owned their own identity. So when we started having our conversations, our participants sort of began surfacing really quickly the sort of underlying things that Bird talks about in her book, that Indianness is not a singular thing, that indigeneity is complex, that it is required not just sort of as an individual thing, but it is both individual and familial and communal, that is part of a larger global struggle for pan-Indian sovereignty. And our participants really were concerned about exactly what Bird cautions her readers to think about. In what ways does the dominance of holding institutions, like the Library of Congress, the National Archives, and even one's local archives and libraries force indigeneity and indigenous scholars into patterns of work that are antithetical to their underlying community values? This is one of the most simplistic questions. But also when we translate that to the digital humanities, how does the digital humanities, which relies on grant-funded projects, encourage competition by Native peoples against one another? In other words, we have general competitions and calls for being an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institute, or being a tribal college and library museum, but there's no sense that, for example, for Indigenous peoples, the native 90% are not actually on reservations and do not qualify for those competitions as a consequence of settler colonialism. And our participants, just as importantly, didn't only want to understand sort of the competition principle or how, you know, archives were functioning to construct the realities of their own communities, but also if digital technologies are rooted in the military-industrial complex, in the post-1950s, in, you know, GPS technology and in, you know, data migration and surfing and harvesting and all of these things that are sort of designed to extract one's relationship with the technology, can digital humanities ever operate to critique the underlying structures of settler colonialism? And I think this is one of the most brilliant things that our participants really sort of began to grasp onto, is that digital technologies themselves are a form of settler colonial control. And we know this to some extent a little bit, right? So we know this about the scandals for Facebook using your data in particular ways, or we know this in terms of conversations about what names you're allowed to use on Twitter, right? So there's all kinds of cases of Indigenous scholars and Indigenous peoples being told that their name isn't real when they apply to use it as social media handles. But in the same way, you know, questions about gender, right? When you're filling out applications to apply for college, the system of gender that we utilize is a naturalized Western system. It doesn't recognize third gender. It doesn't recognize sort of the nuance of that. And even more importantly, the way we're sort of engaging with the digital encourages us to divorce ourselves from the communities we come from. So your community is no longer the people around this table. It's the people you're getting in your social media feed. And for Indigenous cultures in particular, the intimate relationships of community are what kept that community cohesive and survivance. It's you know, been a big thing for them to have those relationships. So what does it mean that one of the first things we want to do for Native communities is to drop digital technology into it that then shows them a world that's not about the intimate and the personal, but is instead about the distant and the future? Here again for us, you know, Bird's framing I think is really useful. She writes really elegantly about this notion of cacophony, about the sound of multiple voices that exist in different registers all at the same time. And what she sort of argues is that these competing struggles within Indigenous society for recognition, for resources, for even simple things like who has the right to speak for the community, basically make it impossible to challenge the settler colonial state. That as much as, you know, communities are able to gesture into diversity and nuance and complexity, the minute they begin to engage with the settler colonial state, the settler colonial state sort of elides that. It wants to make them simplistic and sort of narrow and doesn't like when it's messy, right? It doesn't like when a researcher comes to a community and they say, you've got to talk to 4 different people for approval, or you have to wait 10 months, or you have to follow this very specific process where you show up in person and you appeal to the community and there's a negotiation and that you might be told no. Settler colonialism doesn't like that. It likes order, it likes structure, it likes process. And one of the things that Bird really argues that I think resonates for our participants and for myself is that, you know, this cacophony of voices and this attempt of the settler colonial state to reduce to simplistic representations really misdirects and clouds attention from how it actually is extracting indigeneity from its community. And she says, you know, the cacophony coerces struggles for social justice for queers, racial minority, and immigrants into a complicity with settler colonialism. And that really resonates for me, that there's this notion that minorities must do the work of undoing settler colonialism, that that's some sort of obligation minorities have. And in particular that like, you're supposed to carry that emotional and intellectual and physical trauma with you all the time. And I think that's one of the things for our participants that we sort of struggled with was, in a digital world, we very much talk about it as being liberatory, as it being something that opens us up to the world so that we can see more experiences. But at the same time, by opening ourselves up through these very specific digital channels and through these specific colonial archives, in fact, what we're confirming is that they're okay that they exist in that way, in that form. And that's one of the things that a lot of our participants sort of felt resonated with them, that there is this sort of multiplicity, that having all these voices, having all these complexities produces this sort of antagonistic effect, driven not only for the competition for resources, land, food, water, access, sovereignty, etc., but that these complex notions of who Indigenous peoples are, particularly in a 21st century digital world, oftentimes become conflated into a conversation about race and simple racism, right? So white, black, red, yellow, whatever the characteristics of racism are in the conversation, rather than recognizing that indigeneity and Indianness is not this sort of overly simplistic racial category of the United States or Canada or Mexico or wherever, but instead it's actually a global ecosystem with knowledges that can unseat and unsettle what the settler colonial state is doing. And many of the examples that we discussed as part of this were coming out of the Maori and New Zealand and Auckland and all of these places where the government of Australia has begun to recognize that the underlying systems of access that they have continue to create colonial structures for the people around them. This sort of antagonism and this sort of multiplicity for us, what this really leads us to is a number of conclusions about where the emphasis lies in research. And Bird really rightly argues that Indigenous identity, when we try and sort of use post-colonial tactics and post-structural theories, really results in this sort of unbalanced depiction of Native peoples. Post-colonial theory, for example, wants to emphasize diaspora and diaspora studies, not genocide studies. It wants to emphasize the relationship of the colonizer to the colonized and the way that those interactions occur, rather than how colonized people have talked to one another or created pan-colonized identities. And for us, as we sort of think through these things, there's this very clear sort of sense that what is obscured is the fact that Indians perform a central role, not only in this notion of categorizing racial justice and social justice, but have a very distinct and different relationship to the digital than what other people do. And Bird writes really eloquently about sort of literary characteristics and tropes and all these things, but when we extend that into the digital humanities, part of what we're beginning to think about is that her notion of the limits of post-colonial theory and post-colonial thinking really fits with some of the underlying conversations that Indigenous peoples themselves have been having. And I want to point you to some recent work by Kim Christian. Kim Christian is one of the founders of Mukutu, which is the Indigenous content management system that utilizes tribal knowledge, traditional knowledge labels, and tribal community control. So Mukutu started in New Zealand and Australia and has slowly sort of taken over indigeneity and Indigenous content management in Canada and the US. And Kim just published an article, I think it was not even a month ago, called Relationships Not Records, where she talks about the fact that much of what the digital world does is require the creation of records, of metadata, of categories, of named authority files, and that all of those attempts to create those things for Indigenous people move us farther away from the underlying core values of what an Indigenous community looks like. And she writes here, I think, so simplistically and yet so beautifully, the origins of modern archives are intimately linked to colonial logics of vanishing races, imperial projects of collection, and colonial nation-making strategies. And this is a sentiment that our participants across the board in every workshop, someone had something to say about the ways in which they themselves experience the archive. And I don't just mean in terms of confronting the archive as sets of objects, but in terms of how they were treated as Indigenous people or as scholars going into the archive, trying to work with and talk to people about Indigenous issues. And in one notable conversation, a scholar said, they were really interested in me until I got there and they realized that I was Indigenous. And then it was sort of a question of, what am I doing with these materials? How are they going to be published? Are you going to say something critical of our archive? Are you going to, sort of have things to say that might put us in a bad light? And that's part of what I think, Kim is really trying to push on, is not just that archives that humanists rely on and that digital humanists want to reproduce are sort of colonial in origin, but that they very much are an anchor for how we think about issues of sovereignty and land and history and memory and identity. And I think this is really one of the most interesting things, is that as scholars, we rely on the colonial past to do our work, right? We can't do away with those records. We can't do away with those images. We can't do away with those traditions. But at the same time, by relying upon them, to some extent, we're implicitly endorsing them by saying they should have been collected, they should be used. And that's part of what this talk really takes on, is this notion that, can we begin to create alternative structures through digital technologies that can overcome the colonial nature of the archive and technology itself. And this is something Carrie and I have been working on for a while now. To the extent that digital humanities projects digitize and reproduce colonial documents and images, importantly without or with or without the consent of descendants, such artifacts are complicit in reifying colonial ideologies and depictions of Native peoples as historical subjects and not as contemporary peoples, tribes, and nations. So one of the most interesting phenomena in digital humanities is one of the first steps that most everyone does is they create their own Omeko collection, or they create their own sort of like Wix page with like random things they pull from the internet to like write an argument about. My students love to do this, where they're sort of like, I'm gonna go pick random things from out there and tell you that they all relate to one another and you're supposed to believe me, right? But one of the things that does a lot of times is it naturalizes this notion of discovery, as if those artifacts, those images, those stories, those people are just like standing out there waiting for you to find them, right? And for Indigenous communities in particular, the colonial notion of discovery, right, the age of discovery, is such a fraught term. And the fact that digital humanities and digital technologies have really appropriated many of the scientific terms of the age of discovery. So we discover, we organize, we collect, we harvest, we curate, these are all words that are tied to the project of empire and scientists' motivations to sort of discover the unknowable about the world, that they then quickly turned into, well, the rest of the world is disappearing, so we must preserve you, right? As if Indigenous peoples are supposed to be static and that they don't change, they don't exist, that there's no generation, that there's no complexity, that there's no nuance. And that's one of the biggest things that I think digital humanities is doing right now as a disservice to Indigenous and minority communities, which is we're beginning to federate archives and collections to create things like Omeko exhibits, or to create sort of digital projects that are basically just remixing the ills of early anthropological work, right? We're sort of letting them out there and saying, I've discovered something new. And really what the discovery is not something new about indigeneity, it's something new about how bad white settler colonialism is, right? It's yet another example of how settler colonialism and the settler colonial state has not ended for Indigenous peoples. And so part of what Carrie and I have been talking about that helps frame this, and that we've been sort of working through with our participants, is this notion of difficult heritage. And I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with cultural anthropologist Sharon Mcdonald. She's written this really fabulous work about Nazis in Germany and cultural heritage. And she writes and says, having a heritage, a body of selected history and its material traces, which obviously would include archives, are an integral part of having an identity, and it affirms the right to exist in the present and continue into the future. Following on the work of Gerald Bisner and others on survivance, Amy Lonetree, who was one of the people that very much, her writings and her thinking very much informed a lot of our conversations, has written, knowing our history through the lives of our ancestors opens a recovery process that is central to addressing the legacies of historical unresolved grief that persist in our communities. Through these journeys into the past, we can reclaim our history for current and future generations of Ho-Chunk people. This is the generative capacity of difficult heritage. It entails cultural, political, social, religious, and economic risk, though. So I just want to pause for a moment and think about grief. The rhetoric of digital humanities and the rhetoric of the neoliberal academy is always progressive, that we are moving towards a better future, that we're improving the lives of the people around us. And one of the fundamental questions that no one can seem to answer for me is, how do we account for grief in the digital space? How do we account for mourning? How do we account for a digital world that may not like the fact that what's being done is ugly and hurts people? And we see this with trolling and other things in minor ways. But for me, and for part of this conversation we've been having in this group of people, what does it mean that the colonial archives of NARA and the Library of Congress are themselves producing grief for Indigenous peoples? And Amy's work is really fabulous for this. She talks about going to the Minnesota Historical Society and getting a collection out and opening a folder, and there being a photo of one of her ancestors in it, and having this immense welling of grief that the photo's in a collection run by white people. It's not in her family's holdings. It's not something that she can take out and show her children easily, that it's something, separate from her and her community. And for us, I think, difficult heritage is really useful, right? As sort of thinking about these things that, Mcdonald uses the term in relationship to Nuremberg, but I think it really can also be extended to sort of settler colonial states and the genocide and displacement of Native Americans. If all Native materials are considered difficult heritage, how does open access intersect with this? And one of my favorite quotes from her that I just had to include: difficult heritage may also be troublesome because it threatens to break away into the present in destructive ways, opening up social divisions. And I've been thinking a lot about this with digital humanities, because we like to talk about digital humanities as being free, right? That the software is free, working on it's free. If you only can do the work, it'll be fine. But what that really does is hide the amount of time and energy and money that you put into it as a human being, to learn the technology, to be able to leverage it, to have the server, to go to the archive, to digitize the material. There's a tremendous amount of hidden labor associated with that. And when we think about particularly Indigenous minority communities, when we have to start from the actual process of digitization, the backlog of labor before you even get to the digital components and the cool stuff, right? The things our students like, the visualizations and like dynamic networks that move and change and do things fun. That all relies on hundreds of hours, if not thousands of hours, of unpaid labor that we ask people to do before we even get to the thing that the funder is willing to pay for or that your community might be interested in. And I think a little bit about this. I've been doing digital humanities since 1997, which tells you how old I am. And I think a little bit about this because, when we approach the sort of digital space and we think about indigeneity and labor, a lot of times the stories we sort of tell are that it's going to be good for you. It's going to be good for your community. It's going to be good for the people you work with. But what we don't really tell you is that it's only going to be good for you for 3 to 5 years until it needs to be rebuilt, right? Yeah. Or it's only going to be good for you, as long as that platform's working, right? Mm-hmm. So for Indigenous communities in particular, there's a pretty huge group of people who do a lot of their cultural heritage work and recovery work through Facebook. And one of the projects of a colleague of mine is every time he goes and talks to a tribal community, he talks about the ills of Facebook. What does it mean that your information can be taken and used? What does it mean that if they change the platform, you could lose all of these videos that you've created, or the Facebook Live events, or all of these things that have been created? And for me, I think, one of the most troubling and sort of interesting things about this has to do with the infinite and unanticipated refraction. Depending on the particular frame or difficult heritage, online collections and archives run the risk of the heritage effect, or what others have called the museum effect, a form of commemoration or museumification that valorizes, instantiates, or substantiates colonial ideologies as well as racial and ethnic inequalities. Regardless of the surrounding sort of context, presenting colonial artifacts may be perceived positively or as treasured representations. And in particular here, I'm thinking of the recent online exhibit called Americans by the National Museum of the American Indian that got rave reviews from the public. And behind the scenes, the scholars, including myself who works on mass entry, we all lost our shit because the American that was presented was this very sort of reification of the commercialization and commodification of indigenous peoples, not Americans in the global indigenous sense. So as we think through these things, what we really have to begin understanding is that the digital space mimics early anthropological discourse, which seeks to preserve Indian identity that was supposedly disappearing from the cultural record. In the digital space, this mimicry often falls in the practice of displaying the historical record of Indian peoples as if they're separate from their communities, or by naturalizing colonial terms, names, and categories. For example, it's a common archival practice to privilege the angelicized or anglicized name of a person in a photograph. It's also usually displayed first in the interface, with their indigenous name appearing as a otherwise known as. I just want to pause for a moment on that. You are otherwise known as. When we use that term in the United States in particular, when we use an AKA term, the most often appearance is in the criminal justice system. So when someone says otherwise known as, they're looking at aliases for criminals. During our DNAS workshop, Ricardo Punzlin, who focuses primarily on Filipino indigenous identity, observed that part of the work of the digital humanities is to consider the ethics of archives, and that they must be both prospective and retrospective in our treatment of collections. In other words, we must shift our conversation from archival accuracy and instead recognize how it's unethical to reproduce colonial categories, captions, antiquated, erroneous, or anglicized native names for native peoples, and other forms of colonial data in the digital space. In other words, how did a descendant of an individual photographed by an early anthropologist rewrite the historical record to privilege their community? How does a community combat the colonial machine that documented their genocide? Revising metadata associated with colonial documents, particularly photographs, can be one way, but it also requires significant negotiation with governmental agencies and archives who maintain the records. And they don't like it when they're being critiqued, let me tell you. As Bird highlights for us, the focus on changing individual records does not actually fundamentally change or challenge the systems of those agencies. For example, revenue generated from the sale of indigenous images not only do not return to the communities of origin where they were photographed, but the community is not even asked whether or not they approve of the display and sale of those images. And one of my favorite examples of this is the Edward Curtis collection, which is one of the most distributed collections of digital images. This is the power of the system of Western copyright and reproduction and reuse. Once the US government terms that it's open access, your community loses control of it pretty much forever. So part of what this relates to is this notion of open access, that this notion that the digital humanities should embrace releasing everything as open access, a lot of times obscures the notion that open access isn't healthy for Indigenous and minority communities, that making your stuff more available, making your histories more available, in fact, places even more trauma and pressure on you as an Indigenous person to answer and respond to the things people want to know about. Last week I was up at McGill talking and being part of a series of panels on changing their Native mascot, and was having a conversation with a Native student who was talking about the battle that they've been fighting, and she said very eloquently, you know, every time she opens her mouth, she feels like she speaks for her community. She's like, so I'm supposed to know it all. I'm supposed to know every single thing, every single detail. She's like, I'm so self-conscious when I speak that I'm going to say something wrong, that I'm going to have to apologize. And I think that's part of the weight of doing this research that the digital humanities cannot account for right now. It cannot account for the weight of being able to speak or not speak in a given moment. And we can take this sort of notion about open access and reuse even further when we begin to consider that the historical record, it now exists in computational and digital form. Digital assets, including digital archives exposed via the web, are subject to what the anthropologist Michael Welch calls the endless remix. And everybody knows about this, right? Meme culture, right? And not just meme culture, but picking up and lifting historical objects and patterns and beading and all kinds of things from images that have been digitized that then appear on commercial artifacts, right? So I don't know if anybody's followed the Squaw Shop, which was a big controversy last week, where a white woman has founded an online Etsy business where she's basically taking native visual imagery and she's selling it on t-shirts. And she calls herself the Squaw Shop and has a lovely photograph of her in what she believes is a Sioux headdress, advertising. And her response to this when she got critiqued on social media and elsewhere, because of course it got picked up, was that she was honoring Native peoples and that these images wouldn't be out there if they weren't meant to be used. And I think that's one of the things that we have to think about as we think about open access and the possibilities or limits of the digital world. Why documents and images may be carefully contextualized within a given web-based project domain like Mukutu, right? Like where people have put a tremendous amount of time and energy into creating context. The digital world allows us to move those images and documents and resources directly away from that context. You can screenshot it, download it, remix it, reuse it, and frankly, misuse it. And there can be no doubt that this refractive process of reproduction and sampling has a profound sort of consequence. On the one hand, more people know about Indigenous life and peoples. On the other hand, what they know is completely incorrect. This is the debt of indigeneity, right? That you have to start not from zero where people don't know anything. You have to start from -100 where what they know is so wrong that you have to like spend years getting people back to zero before you can begin building a positive cultural heritage. Importantly for us, heritage items are not passive entities. Our art history, anthropology, museology colleagues have long contended that reproduction that transforms objects as political speech have the potential for misuse. We see this with white supremacy. We see this with the debate in the digital humanities about medievalism and the relationship between white supremacy and that field. This is the inherent risk of open access for us. It allows objects to be divorced from their conditions of production and the context of interpretation for use at will by those without expertise. And Johanna Sassoon has a really great piece where she talks about this digital world being a cultural process driven by market forces in a political arena and not simply technological transposition. So what does she mean by that? Mass media consumption conditions us to distribute and have access to images, not to read and understand them. We are not visually literate about Indigenous and minority cultures. What we're literate about is 30-second memes or you know, sort of social media campaigns, right? We don't want the complexity, we want the soundbite culture. For myself, when I think about this, it's really useful. Dave Gardner is a fabulous new media theorist who works with, if you've never seen the work of Elizabeth LaPensée, she is a prolific video game developer and designer in Canada. She produced, I think, 5 games in 2017 and has another one coming out in 2019 that all translate Indigenous cultural heritage into a gaming environment. So she does ones, the one that she has forthcoming in 2019 is Where the River Runs Through It, which is a translation and work with an Anishinaabe like coming home story. And it's designed for children and is developed and beautifully illustrated by Indigenous artists. Dave attended our workshop series, and this is a quote from a piece that the 3 of them have written together for the use in digital humanities about cyberspace and the digital space. Traditionally framed as a landless territory, Western conceptions of cyberspace risk eliding the core principles of critical Indigenous studies, which are founded in place-based pedagogies. Evoking Indigenous in the digital environments raises vital questions about our relationships to cosmology, space, and lands. It also compels us to ask whether Indigenous lands and life can be repatriated through forms of creative intimacies formulated as cyber justice. For myself, what this quote really is about is thinking about the limitations of the digital world. Much of what we encourage ourselves to think about is the positive side, that the digital space can be a space for alternative stories, for people to tell different voices, to sort of have these spaces. But what we're really not confronting is that the underlying technologies require knowledge about how they operate and how they work. So I don't know how many of you guys have experienced your campaign or your social thing or your article or whatever gets picked up and kind of goes sideways. It goes viral in a weird way, and you're sort of like, I didn't intend for this, right? I didn't intend to sort of be having this conversation and giving you like Indigenous History 101 on the internet, because that's not what this was for. But like, if you need it, okay, great. Like, I'll spend my time doing that. And I think that's one of the things that this particular workshop series really began to question, is that whether there is actually liberation in the digital world for Indigenous people and minorities, that open access and Native heritage are so problematic that allowing them into the digital space is a dangerous act. And importantly, where we came to realize much of the evil for us was in the application programming interface. And this ties directly to Thomas Padilla's talk. So Thomas was here talking about collections as data, which is a fabulous initiative where they are trying to make cultural heritage collections at library and archives and museums more accessible to computers. And by accessible, there's a series of actions from discovery to analysis to production to all kinds of things, with the goal being to increase the use and utilization of those collections in the humanities. But for our participants, the notion that a computer is the one arbitrating the engagement with the data made us all incredibly uncomfortable. How does a computer know when an object should be closed for viewing if it's not listed in a field related to viewing, right? It takes a tremendous amount of work. How, for example, does a computer handle the fact that there are certain objects that should only be seen by certain people, or certain objects that should only be seen by certain times of the year? For us, as we sort of thought through this, we got really anxious, because if we return to this question of all the things that are wrong with the Colonial Archive, how do we go back and get an object that a computer has released to the public? How do we find the object that Thomas's project has released and remixed? There's currently no way to do that. There's no way for a tribal community member who identifies their grandfather as an unidentified Indian in a photo to go find the thousands of times that photo was released and used. And that made our participants and everyone in the room so incredibly nervous, because the notion of recovery requires the ability to actually reclaim. But APIs are not designed for reclamation, they're designed to release. And so Thomas and I and others have had this conversation repeatedly. How do you actually have an automated way to correct things that are inaccurate? And no one has the answer to that. So collections are being released more and more and more through APIs, through downloads on Dropbox, through resources. Libraries and museums have whole hog gone into digitizing their collection to make it available, and I'm so grateful for them for that. But what does it mean when 350 people have the incorrect metadata on a photo that then show up in every single one of their digital and analog publications? How do we run that down and correct that? The potential to possibly amend the historical record, given the interchange between digital and analog, seems to me to be impossible. So where does this leave us? One of the things that I'm proudest of, and I cannot thank our participants enough. Our participants outlined in this really incredible way, like 40-something different values that indigeneity and Indigenous studies can bring to the digital humanities. And these are just a few of them that I wanted to sort of highlight, in part because, interestingly enough, these values were put together and then Jody Bird's book came out, and Jody Bird's book is like all of these values, right? And so it's an interesting synergy of things. For them, the digital humanities, when it considers working with Indigenous materials, should be grounded in land, region, and community. What does that mean? It means you should never experiment with Indigenous materials. Why? Because experimentation is not grounded in the land, the people, or the community. You should recognize the sovereign status of Native American and Indigenous peoples. Sovereignty makes white folks uncomfortable. It does. And sovereignty makes digital worlds uncomfortable. The notion that you do not have the legal right is different from you do not have the ethical or moral right. And the digital world is all about the legalities. It's not about the moralities. And that's part of what our participants really wanted to raise to the digital humanities is, what does a moral digital humanities technology look like? It needs to be tied to contemporary events and peoples. And we've talked about this in other places, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the article that's forthcoming. It's a problem when digital projects come out and they act as if there are no descendant communities, that there's no one with a stake in what's being said or what's being talked about. My favorite gesture is we're going to talk to the Indians when we have time. right? Like, we'll get to community consultation when we have time. It's really expensive. It's really hard. I don't know the people. Well, if it's really expensive, really hard, and you don't know the people, you shouldn't be doing the work, right? You shouldn't be the one in that community trying to do the work. It should be polyvocal. And this is one of the things that, we talk a lot about the digital humanities as collaborative, but we don't actually talk about it as being polyvocal. And to me, there's the distinction. Collaboration is about workflow oftentimes, right? It's about who does what thing, where, and how. Whereas polyvocal, which is, I think, a really useful construct, is about what happens to the dissent. What happens to the interpretations that don't align in a project? Do those become other projects? How do you deal with it when a community, for example, my colleague who's Northern Cheyenne, what do you do with something where a project where the Northern Cheyenne say this project and this thing means this, and the Southern Cheyenne say something different? It's still all about Cheyenne people. But how do you account for that sort of dissent and that polyvocalism? It should be non-essentializing, no tokenization. The Indian should never appear in any way, shape, or form. My students hate me because they're not allowed to use American Indian or Native American when they write. They have to use tribally specific names. And then they keep saying, but there's no tribally specific name. And I keep saying, well, if there's no tribally specific name, what does that tell you about where it came from? Oh, the white people created it, right? Digital humanities needs to do the same thing, right? It's not good enough just to have generic representation. It really needs to be about tribally specific or community specific representation. And my favorite example of this is Meredith McCoy, who's a graduate student at UNC, came to our workshop series and was such an incredible participant, and wrote to me maybe 2 weeks later and said, I'm so inspired by the conversations we've had. I created a website called the Native 90%. I'm one of the 90% of Indigenous peoples who do not live on a reservation and are not considered tribally enrolled in a very specific way. So she's gone out and recruited other Native 90%ers, and they've started basically a live literary magazine where they're publishing art and poetry and scholarship wrapped up in this notion of the Native 90%, that we are the 90% that colonialism removed and did away with. And for me, I think that's a really good example of the non-essentializing nature of what Indigenous studies can bring to digital humanities, is to say, it's not just about the things that are neat and tidy and fit the criteria. Do you have this tribe saying yes? It's what about the other people who can't be part of saying yes because colonialism has removed them from that process. In the same way, problematizing language and structure. Jenny Davis, who's a linguistic anthropologist at the University of Illinois, has really, really interesting work about all the ways in which language is reproduced and disseminated in digital spaces. The Miami Language Project that Daryl Baldwin runs at Miami University with the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. They're talking a lot about how do you translate contemporary digital language back to heritage communities? How do you get that language back to the community so that they can begin using it for their own purposes and their own interests? And I think the final thing, which is where the digital humanities does the most harm, is that it needs to be reciprocal and not prescriptive. Oftentimes when I talk to students and scholars and they're sort of getting ready to think about Indigenous projects or working with minority communities, they're sort of like, I have arrived, I'm here to help. I want to do this thing. And then they're flummoxed when the community says, well, that's not really what we want to do, or we're not interested, or you're not really doing it the way we think it should be done. And that's one of the problems of the digital humanities, is that because we're so tied to grant cycles, because we're so tied to sort of technical, solutionism, we don't do well when what we want to do is not embraced by people around us. And so one of the things our participants really spoke eloquently about was this notion that part of a responsible digital humanities when it comes to Indigenous studies is knowing when not to do your project. When it's your responsibility to not be the person leading the project, not to be the person doing the work, to putting it in a drawer and leaving it because the community is not in agreement, and to not do harm upon the community you want to work with by forcing them to have that conversation that you know is going to fracture or tear them apart. And I think that's one of the things that as we sort of think about the values of digital humanities and we think about the ways in which sort of colonial archives and open access and computational access come together, that's really the underlying value and question I wish we talked more about as digital humanists. What is the harm we're going to do with this project. Not how is it going to help our careers, not how is it going to help us a job. Many of you graduate students, like the helping get a job thing is like a really big thing. But what is the harm this project could potentially do? And so as I end the talk, what I really want to say is what's going on here, what I've seen in the last 2 days, is such a great example of starting from the question of how do we help and not harm? How do we recover and reclaim but not overwrite, right? Like how do we recognize the people who are coming to us but not enforcing on them what we need as arte público, as recovery, as scholar, professor, graduate student. And I just want to say, as I close the talk, you guys should be really proud of what you have going on here. It's not easy work. And I will tell you, other schools and other places have tried to have some of these conversations, and inevitably the concerns about money and having a center or concerns about my career, what's going to happen to me in the future, mean that much of this nuance that our participants was sort of laying out disappeared under the face of the pressure of the academy and of a job and of money. And so, I just want to say as I close, part of what Jody Bird does so well and what Kim Christian and others and what you guys are doing here is show that there's tremendous possibility, but that the possibility has to be kind, that it has to be nuanced, that it has to be generous, and that it has to be deliberate and intentional. And that's the thing I wish for digital humanities. So as was mentioned earlier, I run HILT. HILT has a very intentional digital strategy in terms of embracing these types of complexities. But I also want to mention, I happen to be involved with 2 digital humanities conferences, and we very much want to see proposals that have these types of nuances and challenges and the types of work you guys are doing in them. So the Association for Computers and the Humanities is meeting next summer in Pittsburgh. The call for proposals is out. The deadline is tomorrow, which isn't a lot of time, but the proposal only requires 250 words. Take a swing. And then the following year, if you feel like you need more time, I'm co-chairing the program committee for the annual International Digital Humanities Conference, which is going to be in Ottawa, Canada. And Indigeneity is actually one of its focuses, as is open access. So the work you're doing here and the work you're doing in your dissertations is perfect. And we really would like you guys to come and have things to say. As I sort of end, I just want to say, I would be really happy in the future if I'm not the one who gives this talk. This is one of the things Carrie and I have been talking a lot about is as white women, we're safe speakers about this, right? We're not as disruptive visually and otherwise to people's sensibilities by having the white ladies come in and like tell us we all need to like get woke. It's a lot more stressful when Indigenous peoples are the ones sort of having those conversations. And so my hope is in the future, we're going to put this article out, but that what comes is a flood of indigeneity that really says white folks need to like sit down and shut up. Like, we got this. We're going to do our work, right? And that's my hope for the future of digital technologies and digital humanities, is that we begin to see manifesting truly Indigenous digital projects and digital technologies that make it so that I can't work in this space anymore because my voice isn't needed or doesn't matter or is superseded by the incredible voices of the scholars who attended our workshop. So thank you for having me. I'm happy to talk about any of this. As I said, this is part of a much, much longer piece, but it's also something I'm really proud of. It's not easy in the digital humanities for people to be able to talk about this stuff because the whiteness, the maleness, the Shakespeareans, the whatever you want to call, take up a lot of air, right? So the more we can sort of have these conversations and make other projects accountable in the way you guys are making people accountable for Latinx studies, I think the more the field is going to, I hope, broaden and blossom and grow in ways that are really, really fun and interesting. It means that I don't ever have to talk about topic modeling and tokens and all of those things ever again. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'm happy to answer questions or explain things, clarify. So I'll give you guys, I'll provide to Gabby and Carolina the slides and the actual written portions of the talk, which most of it's in there. I mean, there's little things I riffed, but I'll give you guys that as well. So if you want it, you can have it.
I just,
Go ahead.
I don't want to comment, but you've given me a lot to think about, and
Oh, good.
thank you. It's as I'm starting on my project, I really want to read this book. So
Fabulous.
yeah, I'm excited. I have so many stars everywhere.
It's a difficult read. I gotta tell you, like, I've read it like 3 times now, and it's a difficult read, but it's really interesting because, you know, part of what it's really doing is presenting a new theoretical lens. And even though she's not applying it explicitly to the digital in the book, everything she says aligns so perfectly with what digital work is trying to do. You know, is there a possibility to really unsettle the settler colonial state? Or is this all a facade that we're living, right? That these things are possible. She's at the University of Illinois, by the way. She's a fabulous scholar.
Wonderful, because I mean, at the end, you really can't never like move away. I mean, once you start studying like the, you know, decolonialism and post-colonialism, right? And I mean, you understand that, you know, language is a creation. I mean, all the tools that we have, you know, but we really can dismantle, right?
Right.
The tools that we have can really help us dismantle the master's house, right? I mean, I feel that we can. Like, the hard thing is really, I think, in the work that we've been doing with digital humanities is really seeing, checking in to make sure that we are really still being true to the work that we, you know, that we are being respectful of our of the work that we're working from, and that we are not objectifying that research. I think it's hard. And what I really like, and I like your advice because you are so blunt about it.
I am.
Because as a white woman, right, you have the privilege, you know, that you're able to do a lot of those things. And so how do we come in, like, you know, I don't want to always be, I have to always be the angry Chicana in the room that's going to say, hey, wait a minute, right? Yeah. So you're looking at my, you know, at our archives as subjects, as objects, you know, you're not respecting them in the proper way. I mean.
So, I mean, I think there's 2 different things. I think the first thing is creating spaces that are Chicana only to have these conversations, right? You can't be the angry Chicana in the room when there's 12 of you being angry Chicana in the room, right? Like this is, and I think that's one of the things that was really impressive for us for DNIS was the sort of mixing and remixing of participants where, you know, the Indigenous people were sort of in the corner having like their vote, like it was fabulous because it was an Indigenous centered environment. Right. Every single workshop was dominated by Indigenous scholars and community members in terms of their sort of conversation and presentation, and being in a room where that's going on makes you so aware that part of where white privilege is really powerful is to just reserve the room and sit down and shut up. And I think when we think about the digital humanities, it's not just about sort of the work you're doing and being true to the value systems you have underlying it, but it's about making white digital humanities recognize that those values need to be their values.
Right.
And I think that's the tough work that's really hard to do. But I think we're seeing those strides, right? So we're seeing, for example, projects for the first time beginning to include things that say, this was our community consultation policy, or we went back to these communities and presented this work, and here's what they wanted us to modify, and here's how we modified it. One of my favorite things that I'm just starting to begin to see is digital projects that include an actual cease and desist section, like we have included something that is problematic to you culturally, please remove it. The Colored Conventions Project has a terms of service agreement, and Kim Christian writes about this in her article. She's got 3 or 4 examples of Indigenous communities with terms of service that very clearly are about this type of issue, about like, when you use our stuff, you agree to follow our values, and these are our values. And I think that's one of the biggest contributions you guys can make as a sort of community, is just sort of be explicit about like, what are the value systems that everybody else should be playing by? And then turning to allies in positions of privilege and saying, why are you not calling people to attention? Like, why are you not calling out people? Like, I mean, I gave a presentation last year with Carrie at Montreal, and we actually dissected a DH project live in front of people. and it deals with Edward Curtis. And I got a lot of flack afterwards from people about like, you were giving a live critique. Did you call that person and tell them you were going to be critiquing their project? Are you giving her and the project team a chance to respond to you? And I was like, well, first of all, the project team was primarily white folks, so no. Second of all, no. Third of all, hell no. like why would I give you, like it'd be one thing if we're talking about an Indigenous-centered, community-driven project. That I have an obligation to exchange and talk to the community about if I have concerns. But white folks are doing harm all over the fucking place, and I'm not going to give you a chance to walk it back, right?
Right.
And I think that's part of what your project and the things you guys are doing can really bring to the digital humanities is to sort of like start critiquing and you know, reviewing projects and reviewing archives and reviewing all the things that you encounter, and just start making people up their game. Like, you can't get away with ignoring these values. Here's why. That alone is a tremendous service, but it also then gives you guys groups of people who are more educated about what you do, who can then write letters of support and write endorsements for jobs and can be more engaged with what you're doing as a community, right? So like, that's, you know, you had Trevor and Thomas and I and Julia, and to some extent, you know, the three of us are people with names. Use us. Use the people around you who have names, who have privilege. Ask for things from them. And I think that's one of the things, right, is that there's a hidden cultural world of asking that happens in white DH that doesn't happen as much elsewhere. And we need to change that. We need to change that sort of hidden language about what's allowable and what can be asked for. And I think you got to start pushing people, like throwing some elbows. I'm a big fan of throwing elbows.
Yeah, I think we were pretty successful with our digital humanities speaker series, where we were able to bring in all these amazing scholars, and the scholars have been so gracious with our constituents that they've opened up the doors precisely for that. And I also wanted to add one more thing. I really like the what you discussed in terms of like the open access, where we are pressured, by the university, by every single, organization, the first thing that they ask us, because they're very greedily looking at all the data that we've accumulated, that we've worked on for over 25 years. I mean, that's the thing, like, people don't understand that this is work that has been going on for more than 20. It's not something that our recent graduate students did. I mean, this is like a legacy of work of over 27 years of work. And they expect us to just release that, right? And they become very angry with us when we say, well, we just can't release it. I mean, it's, we have to, somehow figure out a way, follow the proper procedures. And so I'm really glad that you do mention that, because I think we're very concerned about what's going to happen with some of this data once it's out there, if it's going to be taken out of the context that we've given it. We've worked so hard to create that context. And then if it's decontextualized, if it's just, presented out there like, just like any other book,
Yeah, one of the things that I've been sort of rolling back and forth in my head for the last couple of weeks, I was at a seminar a few weeks ago with scholars of American religion, and we were having a conversation about African American religion and experience, and I was in the room for a variety of weird reasons. And one of the things we had our conversation about was the distinction between public scholarship and community scholarship. And I think when we talk about open access, the thing that's really important to me to remember is that open access is driven by the open scholarship and open science movements, which are about the public, right? As if the things we're doing are interesting to the public. That's very generic and is very different than community engaged access, which is the concept that I'm sort of thinking more about, which is not open access in the it's available to the public, but open access in terms of it's available to the community of origin. And what does it mean to create processes that recognize not public access with all the inherent dangers, but controlled community access? Because that allows you, to some extent, some measure of ability to maintain the context to the individual community, and doing sort of what I would think about as like micro data, right? Like micro releases or data sets that are specific to Salvadorans, data sets that are specific to, Mexican communities, or, data sets that are specific to particular interests or thematics, right? And I think that's one of the things is that, you know, when I first started this, I really, really thought everything should be open access and it should be all available. And the more and more I'm developing, the more I think the most responsible thing is community access, not open access. And then if people want access to the things you have, you vet them, you ask them about their intentions. I mean, if white scholars come to you, I think you gotta like seriously think about like, do you trust them? Do you know what they're gonna do with it? So yeah, I mean, I think those are distinctions that matter. I think too, like, you guys have such a long legacy of this stuff that, you know, your power is in your content knowledge and your networks and, I mean, all the things that are in your head, and that can never be duplicated and replaced. So what people are going to want to do with what you guys have is likely going to be a pale imitation of what you could do yourself. So to some extent, I would turn around and be like, that's great, you want to do that. You can partner with us. We'll run the project. You can have this tiny little piece in the corner, but like, you know, you go through us. And I think that to some extent is how digital humanities centers have really built their reputations, is that you had to go through those digital humanities centers, right? Like if you wanted to do lit text, you had to go through UVA, you had to go through, you know, Maryland at one point, you had to go through these centers. And I think to some extent you can do the same thing for Latino studies, is sort of be like, if you want to play with our stuff, you come and play with us. You don't get to take it and run away and do your own little thing.
Right. Do we have any questions from Facebook this time, Lorena? No?
Everybody's at ASA.
I know, right? Everybody's,
Oh, we have people watching
I know.
Oh,
Yeah,
nice.
we do.
from Colorado.
That's impressive.
I just want to say thank you for your talk and for pointing me to some of these sources. And especially your story about this scholar who found a picture, right, of someone they were related to in the archive. Oddly enough, a similar thing happened to me last year. My advisor pointed me, I work on folklore in the Mexican American archive. And my advisor pointed me to this collection that was produced between like 1930 and 1945 by some Anglo man who went to northern New Mexico and recorded people's songs, right? And at the time I didn't know, but months later I would find my great grandparents in there, right?
Oh my God.
And it turns out the University of New Mexico, I think, or the Center of Southwest Research has digitized the audio clips. And so I was then able to go and listen to their voices.
Wow.
But it made me, like, I didn't know how to talk about it to anybody because there was no information about who they were, right?
Well, and I think that that's the trauma, right? It's like they're disambiguated from your family, like as if they're like anonymous out there, and you're like, that's my gram, like that's not.
And it was, I mean, it's in Spanish, and there's songs that like my family no longer knows. It's in a language that I have trouble speaking.
Oh, wow.
So thank you, because now I know how to incorporate that into my introduction.
Yeah, Amy's work is really interesting. The book that she wrote another book on decolonizing museums, but her work is really interesting because part of what she talks about is sort of these moments of confrontation that you sort of have to go through as an Indigenous scholar. I'd encourage you to think about writing an article about this, right? Because like your experience is valuable, not just for sort of like the process of you figuring it out, but it's very sort of autoethnographic, right? Like this is likely happening to other people when they're doing this, and how you think about it and talk about it can be a model for how other people can raise it. Like how would you go back to them and get them to actually identify in the finding aid your grandparents, and thinking about sort of those productive steps, right? Like what would be the thing you would want them to do to recognize that contribution? And I'd encourage you to like write about it or talk about it and think about a conference presentation or at something or a part of your dissertation, talking about like when you do community research on your own community, these are things you can't escape. You can't escape your family and your history and your conflicts and your challenges. And yet we don't teach you how to do that as students. Like this isn't covered in a class anywhere. Like what happens when you run into your family in the archive is not a topic on the syllabus, right? So I think about it because I think you have important things to say about like, not just how it made you feel, but like, how do you wrap your mind around that intellectually, that like your family is now a subject but an anonymous subject in a way that's like awkward and weird and uncomfortable.
Yeah, and just that it's part of this ongoing process, right? Like anthropology, as you said, has
Yeah.
always been about collecting and decontextualizing.
Yeah.
So thank you.
That's really interesting. I don't know if you so there's an Indigenous scholar, Phil Deloria, whose grandmother Ella Deloria was one of the early female anthropologists, and I've heard him talk about this as well. That like it's kind of weird and surreal to him because he's like listening to his grandmother and grandfather's recordings that they did, and he's like, on the one hand, I'm so proud because like they've done this incredible work as early anthropologists and like government officials and all these things. He's like, on the other hand, like I've seen how their work has been misused, and so I'm kind of like, couldn't you have just like put it away in a drawer somewhere, right? Like, couldn't you have just? And so I think like that's the elegance of your voice in this, is that you have something to say that is intensely personal, and that's the type of scholarship we need more of. We need less scholarship that's like a structural bullshitty, like all about yourself kind of ego stuff. We need more vulnerable, like nuanced, community-driven, personal-driven scholarship. And I think, I'd read that article. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'd read that article.
Me too. Any other questions? All right.
Thanks for having
Thank
me.
you so
This was
much,
fun.
Jen. All right, guys, we have lunch, and we're gonna put the sandwiches over here. There's Coke, there's coffee, there's water. Please feel